I can die now. I've been many places, done many things. The one thing I've not done was indulge my childhood fascination with helicopters, and especially and specifically with the model made famous on this show until now. This is the MD500. It's widely regarded as the Ferrari of helicopters. It turns out that is not an exaggeration. It's much bigger than I imagined. The model I fly in the sim seems cramped, and it is. You squeeze yourself into it, but the machine in all its grandeur is surprisingly large when it's in front of you. In a previous video, after a sedate helicopter tour of the Sedona formations, as well as an experience with an H-145 simulator and an intro flight with the modest R-22, I had taken that helicopters are the modern cruise ships of the sky. A relatively reserved experience for the white wine crowd. They won't be serving white wine on this flight. I had said motion rigs seem an expensive overkill in the strive for realism. I hit 1.8 Gs on this term, flying at 90 degrees. There's no motion rig on the planet now, or probably ever, that's going to live up to that. Imagine a roller coaster 500 feet in the sky that you can control the direction of. Never mind its capabilities, just taking off lets you know you're in for an experience. It's like if your friends lifted you up in your chair. It's ungainly, inelegant, and resonating with unbridled power. Imagine how I felt putting my hands on the controls of this legend beast for the first time in my life. I'm grateful for the collective I built, which made a huge difference. In my first actual flight in the R-22, I had been using the joystick paddle for a collective. If you also like to fly fixed wing in the sim, a collective might seem an expensive, clunky luxury, which it is. But for me, I gravitated towards choppers. I came to find fixed wing boring, so I started flying choppers exclusively. And if you don't use a collective at that point, you're doing yourself a major disservice if you aspire to fly as realistically as possible. Because it's possible you might want to take it one step further and experience the real thing at least once in your life. And there's no collective paddle on this thing. The MD500's collective is strangely accurate to mine. A long swing to the active region, and then extremely sensitive. It must have something to do with Helisim's model coding. Mr. D, the captain, said, "Never slap your collective down after landing. The blades are kind of floppy and you might cause a tail strike." Sage advice, Mr. D. The vibration was lower than I expected. Lower than the AS-350 or the H-145. The vibration is not really up and down, it's side to side, which makes sense. If there's any slight imbalance in the rotor, it will be creating a circular vibration, not a bouncing one. Perhaps the butt kicker needs to be mounted sideways. Or perhaps you can buy a cheap, eccentric vibrator motor and mount it to your chair and just turn it on since it's a constant vibration anyway. Are there any coders who can help create an interface using the Sim Racing Studio app? I'm a hardware guy and can create the mechanical electrical interface. Perhaps there's a helicopter-specific enhancement product that can be developed that will be responsive to rotor RPM. The cyclic feels like you're pushing real hardware. The linkages and resistance of the swash plate. You can feel the rotor vibration as the cyclic wobbles in your hand. Coming home to use my joystick feels dead and empty, sterile. Maybe the joystick needs its own small vibration motor. I hovered it comfortably, naturally, and intuitively. It's less about intellectualizing how to respond more zen. Mr. D says flying is by the seat of your pants. You feel it in your butt. In the sim, I often find myself constantly adjusting attitude for altitude. I wander up and down trying to settle to a particular altitude. This seems to also happen in the actual aircraft. In real life, there are updrafts and downdrafts upsetting whatever equilibrium you might have achieved. Mr. D said not to fight the drafts, but also to keep it level. He was constantly pointing out things barely visible in the distance: antennas, towers, other aircraft, birds. He said watch out for the birds, but don't evade them. They'll evade you. Good advice, Mr. D. We need more random birds in the sim. The sound of the aircraft changed dramatically throughout its operation. During startup, at first you hear the clicking of the ignition, followed by the whine of the starter. And then the roar of the turbine as it lights. Finally, you hear a distant propeller airplane flying. That's your rotor achieving idle speed. In flight, there is more rattling at lower speed, but the rattling goes away at higher speed, sounding and feeling more like a rumbling, without the higher frequencies. At high vertical acceleration, there was a definitive buzzing sound. Unfortunately, these aspects are missing in the simulator model. The swath of flight simmers is wide, from the gamers to the realism chasers like me. A helicopter is a visceral experience. It's not just the control of the aircraft, which is a substantial challenge. It's the sensory overload, the vibration, the roar, the chop and whine, the wind, the movement, the G-forces. If you're in the Central Texas region or just visiting, I recommend getting in touch with Mr. D and asking for the captainhelisim experience. But before you do that, you have to get a collective. When I said hovering was a zen-like experience, it was because I turned my brain off and let my body and muscle do what it has gotten used to doing. The first time I flew in a helicopter, I was using a joystick paddle for a collective, and I had to remap that control to my arm, and it felt unnatural, awkward, unintuitive, and at the risk of death or property destruction, quite uncomfortable and borderline frightening. That shouldn't be the first feeling for a simmer. Get a collective first. You can follow my series on how to build your own for cheap, or I could build one for you for $150 more in labor and shipping, or get a professional one, though they are substantially more. But you must have one before you go for your flight, or you'll waste the opportunity in the cockpit of the StarCycle. And that is such a thrilling experience, you want to go in as prepared for the ride of your life as you can be. Mr. D's got you. Oh, I almost forgot. Mr. D said I did pretty good, and apparently Flight Simulator helps. Huh?
Yeah, boy. Yeah, boy.